Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. We have been taught all kinds of terrible things about Thanksgiving. The settling of the New World led to genocide. The Pilgrims took advantage of the natives. Thanksgiving is a time for mourning, and on and on and on. Here to set the record straight is Helen Raleigh. She wrote a great piece at the Federalist titled "Socialism Failed Miserably for the American Pilgrims, just like it does everywhere." So Helen, first of all, thanks for being here today.
Happy Thanksgiving, Kyle.
Thank you. And happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. The Pilgrims landed. How did they organize the new colony?
Well, so many of us learned from at school that the Pilgrims they had a spiritual journey. They came here to escape religious persecution. What we didn't know, many of us didn't know, was that the Pilgrim actually organized their spiritual journey also as a commercial enterprise. So because back then it was very costly to travel from England to the New World, so and also the settlement cost money. So before the settlers left England, they actually contacted investors. They raised money from investors to cover their travel costs as well as the cost to set up a plantation. But investors demanded return. So in exchange, they signed this very strict clause with the investors. So for the first 7 years, every settlers, within this group must live in a communal. They're not allowed to own private property. They're not allowed to own private businesses. So for the first 7 years, everybody shares everything, and their produce has to be shared with the investors back home in England as part of the payment. Only after the 7th year, then all the wealth the settlers accumulated has to be distributed equally between the settlers and the investors back home. So that was the agreement.
So how did that work?
It proved to be disaster. So as I mentioned in my piece, that because people were not allowed to own their private land, were not allowed to own their private, property, and everybody had to contribute to this so-called commonwealth. It turns out people choose not to work very hard. Not everybody wanted to work hard. People who worked hard resented those people who didn't. And when the governors in the colony, William Bradford, when he wanted women to go also to help in the field, and some of them will claim, oh, they're too weak, they're sick, or some will claim that by making people work, William Bradford was exercising tyranny. So, and the first winter they suffered, and throughout the first 6 to 7 years during the colonization of the Plymouth, they always had a food shortage. There was just never enough food, even with the Indians' help. I did mention in my piece, we cannot erase the help from the Indians and help teach them how to plant and catch beavers, do all those other things. But still, with this communal economic and social structure, people refuse to work hard. Not everybody wants to put the same weight, and so they experienced the poverty and hunger for the first 6 or 7 years.
So this really is sort of the forerunner to Karl Marx, to socialism, communism, etc. So William Bradford wrote about this experience, and he basically, what was his assessment of that?
Well, his assessment was that because this is a communal structure, just like you said, back then, even though socialism, the phrase, the concept, the phrase wasn't invented, but the colonization, the colony was very much, it looked like a socialist society. So William Bradford recognized that without the private property, people have no incentive to work hard. And so in his book, he called year after year disaster, he called a brainstorm session. And basically he invited everybody to say, we need to figure out how to do this because this is not working. And by the way, after 7 years, they didn't produce enough to pay back the investors back in England. They have to contact the investors to restructure their debt. And so, anyway, through this brainstorm session, and they came up with the idea that instead of have everybody work for the common goods, quote unquote common goods, commonwealth, they're actually going to divide the land based on family. If you have 5 people, you get a land that can be cultivated by 5 people. So they distribute the land for individual families and make every family responsible for their output and for their own survival. And that has hugely changed the people's incentives. And he recorded in his book that people started working hard. Women who used to claim they were weak and sick now took their kids to the field to help whatever they can.
Interesting. So the effect basically was everyone had he and the sort of the changes that they made unleashed everyone's potential and unleashed everyone's opportunity, and they were able to work for themselves and either work hard and do well, or work not as hard and not do as well. Is that basically what happened?
Right. So he basically introduced the private property as well as the personal responsibility. And there was no lazy people. Everybody worked hard. He recorded in his book that people who used to claim that when he make them to work, that he was exercise tyranny, now eagerly go to field, went to field every day to work hard. Women took their their children to the field to help out whatever they can, and they enjoy the harvest after harvest. Since then, the Plymouth became one of the most successful colonies in North America.
So what do you think is the big takeaway for America today?
The big takeaway of America today, which I've seen, I talk about this over and over again in my book, in my writings, because I lived through socialism, that the socialism is incompatible with free people. It doesn't matter where it was tried. We tried in our own colony more than 200 years ago. We tried in today's Venezuela. We tried in China. We tried in Soviet Union. We tried in Cuba. Everywhere you try socialism, the promises was always sounded, perfect. Everybody will have everything. Instead, at the end, it's always the same. Everybody will have the same level of misery and hunger. So America should say no to socialism. We don't need to give it another try because it has been tried.
What is your personal experience with socialism?
I wrote this in my first book, Confucius Never Said. I grew up with a food ration. I can just give you a quick example. Food ration means that the government will decide how much each person can eat based on a very strict food ration system. Everybody will receive a coupon. So in my case, a little same age girl and a boy, a girl would receive about a boy would receive about 4 more pound rice than a girl each month. So I grew up with, I grew up with hunger. I used to dream about food all the time. And so, but my name was my Chinese name was a boy's name. So for a period of time, the government made a mistake. They allocated me the food ration meant for a boy. I was still hungry back then. And eventually, when the government realized they made a mistake, police showed up at our house one day, and he looked at our registration papers, and he looked at me. He recognized they made a mistake, but they blamed us. They basically made my family to gather all our food coupons together to pay the government back. So our entire family had to go on further diet, quote-unquote diet, in order to save enough food coupons to pay the government back. And so that was just a quick example of the tyranny of socialism.
I think Americans, especially younger Americans, they don't have a clue about the reality of socialism and communism. We get this sort of rosy picture from Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Elizabeth Warren, et cetera, of, free school and free, all of this stuff. But they of course don't paint the reality. And that sort of personal experience, I think Americans need to hear and comprehend and understand that when you start inching down this road towards, everything is free, quote unquote free, that's the direction that we're heading. Now, you wrote this piece for the Federalist 1620 Project. Tell me about that.
Well, our 1620 project is a countering to the 1619 project you probably heard. The 1619 project, led by the New York Times, they try to discredit the founding of the United States. They, instead of talking about the great ideas and the American values, they want to set the beginning of this great nation when the first slave ship arrived. I mean, there's no there's no debate today about the evil of slavery, right? We all learned about it at school, and there's, most of us, unless you are extreme far right, most of us recognize the evil of slavery, recognize our countries, had this dark past, and throughout for the last more than 200 years, we've been doing everything to try to right the historical wrongs, through the Civil Rights Act, through the Equal Rights Act, things like that. So, but by the 1619, basically demeaning all the good things happen, this country and the value that we stand for. And they try to convince people this is all lies. America just has, this is systematic racism from the very beginning, and we never shook this racism off. We're institutional racism, and that's just plainly wrong. And many historians disputed with New York Times about they just misstate so many historical facts. So at our and there are other projects out there counter this project, like the 1776 project. At the Federalist, we decided that we want to talk about the good and the true beauty of the United States, about the founding ideas. So that's why we launched the 1620 project. We're going to talk about the Mayflower, and you probably read articles. We talk about the Mayflower Compact. We're talking about how, yes, we were not perfect back then. Our ancestors, our senators were perfect back then. But the idea they brought over set the foundation for a free and prosperous society that we enjoy today. And we still have a lot of work to do, but we can always look back at those documents and the struggles of the early settlers, the mistakes they make, like the communal living, the socialism they try, and their triumphs, to learn from those historical lessons and take those lessons and guide our today's, actions. And those are the lessons we should teach our kids.
You can find more about the 1620 Project at thefederalist.com, where you can also find Helen Raleigh's piece, Socialism Failed Miserably for the American Pilgrims, just like it does everywhere. Helen Raleigh, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Kyle. And once again, happy Thanksgiving to you and your family.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving. This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back.